There's a studio portrait of her taken in 1945, just after the war. Short dark hair, she's looking straight into the camera. She's faintly smiling, but she's not smiling at the camera. She's smiling at herself. She had just survived what no one, especially not the Gestapo, had ever expected her to survive. There had been a bounty on her head for 5 million French francs since 1942, and they called her the White Mouse. Her name was Nancy Augusta Wake, and her story has been told many times by historians, by novelists, but not everything has been told. This, The Ace of Nerve, is my story about Nancy Wake. 5 million francs. That was the amount that the Gestapo had put on the head of one woman in 1942 in France. And it was the highest bounty offered for any Allied operative in occupied France. They so much wanted to catch her, but they never did. She wasn't a soldier, she wasn't a man. She was a beautiful 31-year-old woman who had been a journalist before the war and trained as a nurse, and who, according to the Maquis, stood 5'2" tall in her boots. In the British files she had a name Hélène, codename Hélène, but the Maquis called her very reverently Madame André, and for her 32nd birthday they made a guard of honor for her. By August 1944, as the war was drawing to an end in France, she had organized more than 7,000 fighters, resistance fighters, in the Auvergne region. She had ordered the destruction of bridges, the ambushing of German convoys, the killing of SS officers, and the organization of weapons and agents to be dropped from England into France. She had done all that, and she had been a wife. Who was she actually? Before the parachute drops, before the stand guns, before the secret codes, before all that, there was Marseille. And in that southern French port city, there was a beautiful Mediterranean apartment with all the luxury she could have and a 5-star personnel. And there was a husband called Henri Fiocca, a rich French industrialist who she called, at least in my books, her scrap king. Now, Henri had courted her with theatre tickets and beautiful flowers and day trips on his yacht and visits to Cannes, and eventually Nancy had said yes. She hadn't been born into any of this. She was raised in Sydney as the youngest of 6 children by a mother she didn't like very much. She had run away at 16, worked briefly as a nurse, and then suddenly inherited some money from an aunt that sent her across the world, first to Vancouver, then to New York, and eventually to London in the early 1930s. She trained as a journalist and worked for Hearst office in Paris, where she reported on the start of the rise of fascism in Germany and Hitler's rise to power. And she was absolutely appalled by that. But here she was in 1939, wife to one of the richest men of Marseille, until in 1940 Hitler invaded France, France fell, and Nancy sat in her beautiful Marseille apartment reading the newspapers, crying over everything what was going on, and decided early on that she was going to take action. So what was it she did in the war? She did almost everything, but she started out small. In May 1940, she used Henri's money to buy an old van, turned it into an ambulance and drove it for the French Red Cross. And when the armistice came, she used the apartment they had in Marseille and another apartment as a safe house for downed airmen that had to escape through the Pyrenees. First it was really small, then it became the Pat O'Leary line, a very famous line. It also for refugees, Jewish refugees, but all sorts of people that had to leave France through what was still Vichy France at the time, so sort of more liberal than the part that was really occupied by the Germans. And then by 1942, the Gestapo had her firmly on their radar. One day she was called the White Mouse, and there was no other way but she had to flee the way that she had helped so many people through the escape route, over the Pyrenees to Gibraltar, then to England, where she was recruited into the SOE, the Special Operations Executive. What she didn't know at the time was that Henri had been arrested by the Gestapo, tortured, and was killed. Not knowing her husband's fate, she parachuted back into France in April 1944 and slowly made her way to the Auvergne, where she was part of the French resistance movement, the Maquis. Then, when they lost their radio equipment, she famously made her 200-kilometer bike ride to get word to London, to find another operator who could send word to London that they needed new equipment, and that bicycle ride almost killed her because she also had to make the 200 kilometers back to base. In another attack she was part of, she actually killed an SS officer with a karate chop she had learned. Well, whether this is true or part of the mystery around Nancy Wake, there's a lot of debate about it, but she claimed she killed an SS sentry with her own bare hands. And then, when the war was finally over and Vichy, the city of Vichy, was celebrating the victory over Nazi Germany, it was there that Nancy finally found out that her husband had been killed almost 2 years earlier. And she had to go back to Marseille. She came back the most decorated woman of the Allied forces, the George Medal from the British, the Médaille de la Résistance and the Croix de Guerre with 3 different palms by the French, the Medal of Freedom by the Americans, and much later from her own country, the Order of the Companion from Australia. What she did not get back was Henri, her beloved husband. At the end of the war, she had to go back to Marseille alone and find an empty apartment, raided by Gestapo wives, all her beautiful things that gone. Just one copy of her beloved book, Anne of Green Gables, which she had brought all the way from Australia, she found in the cellar of their house. Even his wine was stolen. Nancy lived long after the war. She remarried. She eventually passed in London in 2011 at 98 years old. And she lived hard after the war. She drank a lot. She talked about being depressed. And in my books, basically, it is about her medal. So, in my books, in comes a Roatui, a young Maori woman who becomes her nurse and who Nancy tells her story one more time. But in exchange, Aroa has to find what Nancy says are her stolen medals. We all know they weren't stolen. It's all over the internet. She sold them herself. But that's not what Nancy tells Aroa, because I believe that Nancy thought these medals belonged as much to Henri as they belonged to her. And she felt guilt-ridden about them. Anyway, it is a long saga, and we will find out whether Aroa will reunite Nancy with her medals. Never with Henri, but perhaps with her medals.